Before I tell anything about propaganda, I want to ask you two questions. First of all, does propaganda work? And the second question, does it ever or did it ever work on you? In my last video, I talked about how these different groups in society in the beginning of the 20th century joined together and formed the totalitarian movement. Those were the elites, the mob, and the masses. They really hated the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie were the people in power. So the elites and the mob, they joined together, they formed an alliance, and they had to win over the masses. But how did they do that? By propaganda. Like I told in the last video, they all really hated the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie talked about realism and humanism, but eventually they didn't live by their own standards. They didn't live by what they propagated. It's very important to realize that before the totalitarian movement came to be, people lived in complete chaos and insecurity and nihilism. And it's because before people belonged to a group, to a class. But then the classes disappeared and people melted together in one huge mass. And so all stability had disappeared. Even God died, like Nietzsche said in the end of the 19th century. God had died. There were no classes. People didn't belong to a group anymore. There was no stability. And the bourgeoisie, the people in power, were a bunch of hypocrites. They told all these lies and they kept lying every time. And people, they didn't know what to believe. So you have to imagine living in a state of total insecurity. Everything that once was is not anymore. There are no beliefs. There is no higher purpose in life. Everything is insecure. There's no steady ground beneath your feet. And so these masses, they really needed some stability. And so the mob and the elites, they offered them this stability in the form of ideology. Nazism was based on the laws of nature. It was all science, it was biology, because it was survival of the fittest, and eventually the fittest people would be like the superhuman, the Übermensch. And according to their ideology, the Aryan race would eventually be the strongest human race. But their blood and their genes had been defiled by weaker races and weak people, like the Jews, the gypsies, homosexuals, physically ill people, mentally ill people, all kinds of people that were not meant to be Übermensch, the superhuman. So, according to nature, eventually the Aryan people would be the strongest, but they had to be cleansed from the weaker races, from the weaker people. It was all science. And as for the communists, according to their ideology, it was the laws of history that eventually decided that the working class would prevail. The working class would rule. And everybody would be equal because everybody would be working class. There would be no more poverty and no more pain. And so they offered these utopias. These ideologies, they were really appealing to the masses because it was either this or all the lies from the bourgeoisie. At one point, everything that was not visible became the most important thing ever. People started to believe in all these kinds of conspiracy theories. Conspiracies from the Jews, conspiracies from the American Secret Service, from the British Secret Service, from the most wealthy families, from the Freemasonry and conspiracies from Trotsky. And in order to beat those conspiracies, because they really believed in those conspiracies, in order to beat those, they had to put their own conspiracy against it. But they didn't realize that eventually their own conspiracy would make the whole world hate them. So these days we can see a lot of people that have conspiracy theories on one side, and on the other side there are people that think that all conspiracy theories are bullshit, and they mock the people that come up with conspiracy theories. But as we can see here, because of believing in conspiracy theories, people created their own conspiracy. So it's not that conspiracy theories are necessarily wrong, because Nazism and communism were based on conspiracies. They were conspiracies in itself, and they were true. They happened. So like I said, the masses, they wanted stability because they came from a place where there was total instability. God died, they didn't belong to a group anymore, there were lies all around, and they needed stability so bad. So they started to create their own conspiracy. They started to believe in these lies. Lies given by propaganda. And these lies had to be consistent, because the ideology is about a consistent world. Everything is according to that one rule. And here's something that is really interesting, because if everything is completely consistent, then you might say like, yeah, well, that's a proof that the rule, that the theory works, that it's true. But on the other hand, common sense knows that like, no, the world isn't that consistent. Because, for example, if everybody who gets imprisoned comes with exactly the same statement, for years, and all these people have exactly the same statement of what they did, it's very consistent, but we know that that can't be right. Imagine you get imprisoned and you deny the accusations. Then that isn't according to the consistency. And so will people believe you? Will your friends and will your family believe you if they actually really want this consistency? A very important way to prove this consistency and to prove the ideology was by the use of science. Like I said before, the Nazis based their ideology on the laws of nature, and the communists based their ideology on the laws of history. It's both science. They used science all the time. It's of course pseudoscience. Yes, we know that now. But back then, people really believed that this was actual science. In the end of the Middle Ages, people started by developing science more and more. There was a big interest in science, and this developed and developed and developed. And eventually, you might say that a totalitarian society is the last phase of that. And it was not just delivering evidence of the world today, it was also delivering evidence of the future. And in that way, there's no discussion possible. Because if you say like, okay, so today we are not very healthy, we're not very strong, but that's because of our genes and our blood is defiled by weaker races. But in 100 years, then we will be the strong race. We can't prove it actually right now, but in 100 years, you'll see. And the same story for the communists. In 100 years, there will be this utopia. And the working class will rule, and nobody will be hungry, nobody will be poor. Everybody will be happy, because that was their goal, to make everybody happy. Also the Nazis, they wanted to make people happy by promising them this utopia. And this is also very similar to the whole climate change story. They talk about the far future, in 50 or 100 years. Of course, you can't really prove that, you can only predict that. They use science to predict that. But up till now, none of their prediction came true. But still, they keep up this story. And it's easy because, it's a promise for the far future. So there's no discussion possible right now. And also the fact that they say the science has settled. They say that about a lot of things. The science has settled. Also with Nazism and communism. There was no discussion possible. The science had settled. Those were facts. At least they believed they were facts. But they weren't. But they believed it. Because it was science. And who can deny science? Right? They didn't adjust their ideology to the real world. No, they adjusted the real world to their ideology. And so they only didn't use science for that, they also used history for that. Because the stories of history, they believed, were corrupted by the people in power, by the bourgeoisie. And because everything they did and everything they told was a lie, they wanted to change the history books. And they did. And actually that's also what we can see today. At least in my country, they are changing the museums now and the history books to focus more on black slavery. Not slavery in general, black slavery. To adjust everything to their ideology, the totalitarians used science to predict the future according to their ideology. They used history to change history according to their ideology. And they used lies and propaganda and lies and consistent lies to control the present. And the masses were willing to believe these lies because otherwise the other world was of the lies of the bourgeoisie and a life of instability, a life of nihilism. And like I said, they didn't want that. They didn't want any of that. So they went with the propaganda from the totalitarians. Things like rationality, common sense, and actual facts, they couldn't accept that anymore. Because those were things that belonged to the bourgeoisie, to the life that they resented. And so they were most willingly to go with all the lies of the propaganda. And those lies, they became greater and greater because, of course, they had to adjust reality towards their ideology. Otherwise, it wasn't consistent. And so they believed that life was malleable, that they were actually in control of life and society. They could create whatever. They could do whatever. There was no morality anymore because God died, so they could actually do whatever. And that's when they committed the worst atrocities. But there's always this part of reality that you just can't adjust. And so to even make people deny that part that is not adjustable to ideology, to even make them deny that, propaganda didn't work for that, so they used violence and terror. And then eventually, also like in the story of George Orwell, 1984, they can even make people deny that 2 + 2 is 4. So eventually, people are not being convinced by just simple facts. They are not being convinced by their own experience. People are convinced by consistency and repetition. And so the totalitarians use, like I said, science, history, and propaganda, a lot of repetition, to convince the people to believe in their ideology. And eventually, for the last part, they use terror and violence. Eventually, the totalitarian leaders, they close off society from the outside world. They are completely isolated and propaganda is all around. But once the totalitarian leaders, once this movement seizes power, then the propaganda stops. They only use propaganda as foreign policy, but for their own people, they don't use propaganda anymore. They use terror and violence. And it should be omnipresent. Even when you are a member of the party, even when you are high ranked inside the party. This is what the Nazis and the communists did. Because you should never be safe anywhere. You shouldn't think that once you have a good position somewhere, you are safe. No, you're not. You can also be murdered there. You are nowhere safe. They wanted complete power. And you can only have complete power if you completely control people. And how do you completely control people? First by convincing them by using propaganda, later by using terror. And so propaganda is a tool to seize power, and terror is the essence of a totalitarian society. There were many times that Hitler and Stalin, they didn't even use lies and propaganda to convince the people. They actually said what they were about to do. They were actually being honest. But people just didn't believe that. People didn't listen carefully to what they were saying. But it's also important to kind of decipher what they're saying, because what they're literally saying, they mean that. But because it's so crazy, it's hard to understand what they exactly mean. For example, when Stalin said that the subway in Moscow is the only one in the world, at that point it was a lie, of course, but what did he mean by that? He meant that eventually all subways everywhere in the world should be destroyed, so that the subway in Moscow would be the only one in the world. It was a prediction. And so that is also how you should listen to politicians today. If they say something that is a prediction, it's their plan. They're going to do something with it to realize that. They're not lying. When they talk about a new normal, they're not lying. It's a prediction. They mean that. When Frans Timmermans in the European Union said, Europe will be diverse, whether you like it or not. It was a prediction. He means that. And so this is the way you should listen to politicians. It's not that they are fantasizing or exaggerating. They are honest. They are totally honest about their intentions. The intention is the new normal. They're not planning on making things normal like they used to be again. When they talk about the new normal, they actually mean it. They mean it. And we should be careful. And today we can also see that politics and science are intertwined, like back then in the 20th century. And that is very dangerous. I'm not saying that all science is a lie, but once science gets intertwined with politics, chances are that it's very corrupted. So to summarize everything, the masses are not convinced by simple facts. The masses need to be convinced by propaganda. And in propaganda, they manipulate science, they change history, and they change the world how it is today to fit their narrative. They come up with complete lies, and these lies are actually predictions because they want to make their lies into reality. Once this gets further and further and further, eventually They're going to use violence and terror to make you deny the lost facts that they can't convince you of by using their propaganda. That is how it happened back then in the 20th century, and there are parallels with today. So please be careful with what you believe. Please be skeptical. Please think for yourself and read books. Read this book, for example.